Book 7 of Herodotus, and the action really gets going. I know I just said that to try and sound more exciting. However, 20th, 21st, 22nd Logos of Book 7, where we move from the invasion of Datis and Artaphernes on behalf of Darius in 490 BC to the 480 BC invasion of Xerxes, a much more significant and serious affair. So you'll remember the start of Book 7, of course, is the agon between Xerxes, Mardonius, and Artabanus over whether to invade. Xerxes is a bit undecided at the start of Book 7. He is not so sure he actually wants to have an invasion. He says he has no great enthusiasm for the campaign. But Mardonius, who's got his eye on maybe being the governor of Greece and taking over stuff, puts a very strong case to Xerxes, and there's an argument between them, a formal argument that Herodotus records, and eventually they get to a point where Xerxes decides he is going to invade. He then has a funny night where he's not sure whether he should or not, and the Phantom finally persuades him to invade. As part of the preparations for this, they dig the canal at Mount Athos that will save them from having to sail around the treacherous waters of Mount Athos. They bridge the Hellespont, and don't forget also that Pythias makes his request to have one of his sons allowed to stay at home rather than all 5 of them go to the war. It's not very successful as a request, given that despite the fact that Xerxes, after Pythias has offered him money, gives him the official rank of friend, a few days later he chops Pythias's eldest son in half, and the army march between them as a instruction for the fact that people should actually be making the effort, not trying to hide behind safety at home. So, as you get to the middle of Book 7, we get to the 21st Logos, and the Persians cross into Europe. Now, there are a whole range of omens, aren't there, that Xerxes has chosen to ignore. The first one is that the bridge at the Hellespont has been destroyed by a storm, and he doesn't listen to that one. There's an omen of the strange dream that Xerxes has of an olive tree growing out of a crown that spreads its branches out. He has a dream of, he sees an eclipse of the sun. He's not sure about. They come across a strange mare that gives birth to a hare, and also a creature that has its genitals all in the wrong way around, with the male above the female genitals. And all of Xerxes' advisors say, no, these are great omens, despite the fact that Herodotus is obviously presenting them to suggest they're not great omens, and any fool can see that the gods are saying that you shouldn't be invading. Xerxes, of course, doesn't do that. As they cross further into Europe, Xerxes calls Demaratus, who we mentioned in Book 6, to give him some advice about what are the Greeks actually like. There's a number of things that the Persians don't understand about the Greeks. One thing they're a bit worried about is the fact that the Greeks compete in games just for a laurel wreath, not for money, just for honour. They can't understand what it is about the Greeks that causes all this. And so Xerxes asks Demaratus, are these Spartans really so well-armed as everybody makes out? Demaratus wisely says, do you want a truthful answer, O king, or a pleasing one? Something to remember when you're in employment and your boss asks you a question. Demaratus knows that Xerxes has a very short temper, and if he gives him a truthful answer he doesn't like, he might get into trouble. Xerxes asks for the truthful answer, but then doesn't believe Demaratus when he says the Spartans are more than a match for the Persians. We then have a lengthy description about the Persian army, which at this stage, as they cross into Europe, is over 1 million strong. It will later be, according to Herodotus, 5 million. Lots of stories about the different people. Remember, they're counted by putting them into a kind of a pen of 10,000 at a time. And then earth and water demands are sent out to the Greeks, with the exception of the Athenians and the Spartans. And Herodotus reports that the Athenians and the Spartans don't get a request for earth and water, because when Darius did that, the Athenians, do you remember what they did? That's right. They chucked their messengers down a pit. And when the Spartans received the messengers, they threw them down a well. Now, the Spartans to try and make up for this offence, send Spercheius and Bulis to Xerxes as a sacrifice, expecting Xerxes to be killed. Perhaps unexpectedly, for what we've read about Xerxes so far, Xerxes doesn't kill them. In fact, he treats them well and then sends them home. So perhaps that shows us a little bit more sophistication to Xerxes' personality, or unpredictability to his personality. The latter part of Book 7 is the Greek preparations running up to Thermopylae. At the start of this section, Xerxes has got his army. It's looming into the main part of Greece, and Herodotus tells us of the wooden walls prophecy that the Athenians receive. He reminds us that Themistocles has earlier been successful in persuading the Athenians to spend the money from the silver mines at Laurium on building a fleet. And then, when they get a prophecy from Delphi which says, woe, doom, disaster, Themistocles goes back to Delphi and says, can we have a second prophecy, please? And they prophesy you'll find your safety in wooden walls. Themistocles likes this because it means he can then sell that as we need to use the fleet, the wooden walls of the fleet. Other Athenians think it's the wooden walls around the Acropolis. They will later to be shown to be a little bit in the wrong on that front. The Greeks scurry off to go and negotiate with Argos, also unsuccessful, and Gelon, who's the tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily, also unsuccessful. So as we build up towards Thermopylae, we can see the Greek alliance is rather small, under pressure, and yet the Greeks decide, right, we're going to have our stand at Thermopylae. This is what they're going to do. Leonidas is going to lead the Spartans, and he's going to try and make sure that the Persians are held up here, and the Spartans can, in a way, make up for their failure to be there at the Battle of Marathon in 490. So we have the account of the battle, which goes on for 5 days in terms of its sort of standoff, etc. Eventually, Leonidas and the Spartans are betrayed by Ephialtes, who tells the Persians about the goat track, and there's a heroic last stand where the Persians finally kill the 300 Spartans. Remember, of course, not just Spartans, the Battle of Thermopylae. Best quotes of Book 7. I have come to the conclusion that it was Xerxes' relish for magnificence that prompted him to order the digging of the canal. Here we get a clue into the way Herodotus sees Xerxes. He thinks he's a big show-off. He thinks he's a big lover of himself, and we call that hubris. There was no need to dig a canal. He did it because he wanted magnificence, and that underpins a lot of the portrayal that Herodotus gives us about Xerxes. Along with that is Xerxes' anger. We see Xerxes' anger flare up constantly through the invasion, but lashing the Hellespont 300 times is a good example of it. And we have in chapter 139 of Book 7 this critical view of Herodotus. It's at this point I feel compelled to express an opinion. And this is where, out of the blue really, Herodotus says that had the Athenians been intimidated into abandoning their homeland by the menace that was bearing down upon them, or had they stayed put but surrendered to Xerxes, then no one would have sought to combat the king at sea. And had there been no one to oppose Xerxes at sea, what would have happened at the mainland? And therefore, he's saying that it is the Athenians who are the saviours of Greece. And so this is a critical extra point, I think, to summarise the way in which Herodotus is presenting his history. Xerxes has hubris, his hamartia, his fatal flaw is anger, and the Athenians are critically important. And then finally, Book 7, Chapter 226, if the Medes hide the sun, then we can fight them in the shade. It may be overcast when you come to do your exam, but you can write that essay in the shade. The heroic sacrifice of the Spartans, remembering what they did in Thermopylae, is the final critical quote. So that's about Book 7, and we'll move on, if you want to Book 8.